A young student finds herself in a desperate situation and is forced to marry an elderly billionaire to save her family. But a week after the wedding, she learns a truth that turns her life upside down. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching this video from. Lisa adjusted the thin strap of her worn-out backpack as she trudged down the cracked sidewalk of her neighborhood. The air was thick with the acrid smell of car exhaust, mingling with the faint aroma of fried food from the corner stalls. Her breath came out in soft puffs in the chilly morning air, and she clutched her coat tighter against her body. The rhythmic clicking of her worn-out sneakers against the pavement was the only sound she allowed herself to focus on as she approached the bus stop. The bus ride was a daily routine Lisa had memorized. It was a short escape before the weight of her world came crashing down again. 22 years old, and already carrying the kind of responsibility that most people wouldn't face in a lifetime, Lisa's days were an endless cycle of work, school, and worry. She was a medical student at a local university, juggling her studies with part-time work as a waitress. The dream of becoming a doctor had been hers since she was a child, fueled by the countless hours spent taking care of her sick mother and younger siblings. But lately, that dream felt like a distant star, visible but utterly unreachable. Home wasn't much of a reprieve either. Their small apartment was bursting at the seams with people and problems. Her mother, once a vibrant and strong woman, had been battling diabetes for years. The illness had taken its toll, leaving her weak and in constant need of medication they could barely afford. Lisa's younger brother, Jamal, was 13 and perpetually in and out of trouble at school. He needed guidance, structure, things Lisa wanted to provide but simply didn't have time for. Her youngest sister, Nia, was 7, her innocence slowly eroding under the weight of their circumstances. And then there was the rent. Late again, as always. The landlord had been by yesterday, pounding on the door, his voice laced with irritation as he demanded payment. Lisa's mother had sat in her usual chair, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped her tea, while Lisa had promised to figure something out. Figuring something out was the story of her life. As the bus lurched forward, Lisa stared out the window, her reflection blending with the dilapidated buildings that whizzed by. She thought about her shifts at the diner, where the tips were inconsistent and the hours long. She thought about the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, growing taller each day. And most of all, she thought about her classes, the lectures she was barely keeping up with, the assignments she submitted late, the exams looming like dark clouds on the horizon. It was all too much. By the time she returned home that evening, her body ached with exhaustion. She dropped her bag by the door and made her way to the kitchen, where her mother sat with a cup of tea, her face pale and drawn. The moment Lisa entered, her mother looked up, concern etched into her features. "Lisa, come sit," she said, her voice soft but strained. "We need to talk." Lisa's stomach tightened. She knew that tone. It was the tone her mother used when the news was particularly bad. Obediently, she sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Her mother hesitated, glancing toward the small living room where Jamal and Nia were watching TV. When she spoke, her words were quiet but heavy. "We can't keep going like this. The landlord came again today. He's given us 2 weeks, Lisa. If we don't have the money by then—" Her voice trailed off, and she didn't need to finish the sentence. Lisa knew exactly what would happen. They would lose the apartment. They would have nowhere to go. Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "I'll pick up more shifts," she said quickly. "I'll figure something out." Her mother shook her head. You're already doing too much. You can't keep this up." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Lisa frowned, rising to answer it. Standing on the other side was her Uncle Marvin, a burly man in his 50s with a gruff demeanor. He was a truck driver, always smelling faintly of engine oil and coffee. Lisa hadn't seen him in weeks, and his sudden appearance filled her with unease. "Uncle Marvin," she greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here?" He didn't respond immediately, instead glancing around the cramped apartment with a critical eye. Finally, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I came to talk," he said. "It's important." They sat down in the living room and Marvin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I know things are hard for y'all," he began. "I've been thinking about how I can help, and I got a proposition for you." Lisa's heart sank. She didn't like the sound of this already. "There's a man I used to work for," Marvin continued. "Rich, real rich. Lives in this big old house on the other side of town. He's looking for a wife." Lisa blinked, stunned into silence. "A wife?" she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. Marvin nodded. "Yeah, he's an old white guy, 65, I think. Got some kind of illness, so he ain't got much time left, but he's willing to pay real good money for someone to marry him." Lisa stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're not serious." "I'm dead serious," Marvin said. "He don't want no romance or nothing, just a legal arrangement. He'll take care of you, your mama, the kids, everything. And when he goes, you get the inheritance." Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. The idea was absurd, insulting even. But as Marvin laid out the details, the money, the security it would bring, it became harder to ignore the practicality of it. She thought about her mother, her siblings, the eviction notice hanging over their heads. This wasn't the life she wanted, but it might be the only way to save the people she loved. When Marvin finally left, Lisa sat in silence, her head in her hands. She felt trapped, cornered by circumstances beyond her control. She had always dreamed of a bright future, one where she could stand on her own 2 feet and make her family proud. But now, that dream seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. By the time she went to bed that night, Lisa had made her decision. She would meet this man, this wealthy stranger, and see for herself if this deal was something she could stomach. It wasn't what she wanted, but it might be what she needed. For now, that would have to be enough. Lisa stood outside the wrought iron gates of the mansion, her fingers nervously clutching the strap of her bag. The imposing structure before her looked like something out of a movie. A sprawling estate with manicured lawns, marble fountains, and towering oak trees lining the driveway. The sheer grandeur of it all made her feel small, insignificant, as if she didn't belong here. Her Uncle Marvin, who had driven her to the meeting, gave her a reassuring nod before pulling away in his battered pickup truck, leaving her alone. The gates creaked open slowly, as if to emphasize the weight of what she was about to do. A uniformed man emerged from a small booth beside the gate and gestured for her to follow the cobblestone path toward the main entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last as Lisa's mind raced with doubts and questions. What kind of man was William? Would he be cruel, dismissive, or worse? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she pushed forward. She had no choice. When she reached the front door, it opened before she could knock. A butler, tall and impeccably dressed in a black suit, greeted her with a polite bow. "Miss Lisa, I presume? Mr. Harris is expecting you. Please, follow me." The interior of the mansion was even more extravagant than the outside. Polished floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with expensive artwork and family portraits. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood, but there was an unmistakable stillness to the place, as though life had been drained from it. Lisa followed the butler down a long hallway, her eyes darting around, trying to take in the opulence while keeping her nerves in check. Finally, they arrived at a set of double doors. The butler knocked twice before pushing them open, revealing a spacious study bathed in warm, golden light. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, and a large mahogany desk stood near a window overlooking the garden. Behind the desk sat William Harris. He was nothing like Lisa had imagined. William was tall and lean, his posture rigid as he leaned back in his chair. His hair, a mix of silver and white, was neatly combed, and he wore a tailored suit that seemed effortlessly elegant. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes were sharp and observant, studying her with an intensity that made Lisa feel as though he could see right through her. "Miss Lisa," he said, his voice deep and measured, "please, have a seat." She hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room and lowering herself onto the chair across from him. William's gaze remained fixed on her, his expression unreadable. Lisa's palms grew clammy as the silence stretched between them. "You must be nervous," he said finally, breaking the tension. "I can't blame you. This situation is unconventional, to say the least." Lisa nodded, unsure of what to say. Her voice felt stuck in her throat, so she simply waited for him to continue. "I understand that your uncle explained the arrangement to you," William said, folding his hands on the desk. "I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not looking for a romantic partner, nor am I interested in any kind of physical relationship. What I need is a legal spouse, someone who can fulfill the basic requirements of marriage on paper. In return, I will ensure that you and your family are taken care of." His words were calm and businesslike, devoid of emotion, yet there was an undertone of something else, regret perhaps, or weariness. Lisa studied him carefully, trying to discern his true motives. Despite her initial fears, he didn't seem threatening or predatory. If anything, he seemed distant, as though he were already somewhere far away in his mind. "Why me?" Lisa asked finally, her voice steadier than she expected. William tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. "Your uncle spoke highly of your character. He said you're intelligent, hard-working, and selfless, qualities I admire. And, if I may be blunt, I was drawn to the idea of helping someone who genuinely needs it." Lisa didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being described in such flattering terms, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his reasoning than he was letting on. William leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening slightly. "I won't pretend this is an easy decision for you. It's not an easy decision for me either, but time is not on my side, and I've found that people often reveal their true selves when they think they have nothing to lose. I'm giving you an opportunity, yes, but I'm also taking a risk. I hope we can approach this arrangement with mutual respect." Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat. The way he spoke, so calm and deliberate, reminded her of the professors at her university. People who lived in their own world of logic and reason, detached from the chaos of everyday life. She couldn't tell if he was being genuine or simply putting on a convincing act. "I need some time to think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. William nodded. "Of course, take all the time you need. But if you choose to proceed, understand that this will be a binding agreement. I expect honesty and discretion." He reached for a folder on his desk and slid it across to her. This contains the details of the arrangement. Review it carefully. If you decide to move forward, contact my assistant, and we'll make the necessary preparations." Lisa hesitated before taking the folder, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather. As she stood to leave, William rose from his chair and extended his hand. She shook it reluctantly, surprised by how steady and warm his grip was. "Good luck, Miss Lisa," he said, his tone almost gentle. "Whatever you decide, I hope it brings you peace." As the butler escorted her back to the front door, Lisa's mind raced with conflicting emotions. The meeting had gone differently than she'd expected, but she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. William Harris was an enigma. Cold and detached on the surface, yet there was something about him that felt genuine, even kind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something he wasn't telling her. When she stepped back out into the crisp evening air, Lisa felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like never before. The folder in her hand felt heavier with each passing second, a physical reminder of the crossroads she now stood at. Her family needed her, but at what cost? Could she really go through with this arrangement and marry a man she barely knew? As she walked away from the mansion, her heart and mind were locked in a battle she wasn't sure she could win. The day Lisa moved into William Harris's mansion, the sky was overcast, matching the heavy knot of unease in her chest. She had spent the last few nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her family's cramped apartment, replaying every moment of their meeting. The weight of her decision was suffocating, but the sight of her mother's relief and the sound of her siblings' laughter when she told them everything would be okay had solidified her choice. Now, standing at the gates of the estate once again, Lisa felt more like a stranger in her own body than ever before. The black SUV that had brought her from her old neighborhood pulled away, leaving her alone with a suitcase and a house that looked too large, too quiet, and too distant from the life she knew. The butler, whose name she had learned was Mr. Collins, greeted her with the same polite bow as before. "Miss Lisa, welcome. Your room is ready. Shall I show you the way?" Lisa nodded, clutching the handle of her suitcase tightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the echo of her own footsteps on the marble floor as she followed him inside. The mansion was as pristine and overwhelming as she remembered. The walls, adorned with art and framed photographs, seemed to tell the story of a family that no longer existed. The silence was even more palpable now that she knew she would be living here. Mr. Collins led her up a grand staircase, past a long hallway, and finally to a room at the far end. He opened the door to reveal a spacious bedroom, bathed in soft, natural light. The furnishings were elegant but simple. A large bed with crisp white linens, a writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe that dwarfed the suitcase in her hand. "This will be your room," Mr. Collins said, placing a key on the desk. "Mr. Harris prefers his privacy, so your quarters are on the opposite side of the house from his. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Lisa nodded again, unsure of what to say. She thanked him quietly as he left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in her surroundings. The room was beautiful, far nicer than anything she had ever known, but it didn't feel like hers. It felt temporary, like she was an intruder in someone else's world. Setting her suitcase down by the wardrobe, Lisa walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The view overlooked the garden, with its neatly trimmed hedges and a small fountain in the center. She could see a gardener working in the distance, his movements methodical and precise. Everything about this place was orderly, controlled, nothing like the chaos of her old life. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned to see a middle-aged woman with a kind smile and an apron tied around her waist. "Hello, dear," the woman said. "I'm Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper. I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you needed anything." Lisa forced a small smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Porter." "I'm fine, thank you." Mrs. Porter's smile widened. "You must be overwhelmed. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? But don't worry, you'll get used to it. And if you need anything at all, just let me know." Lisa nodded, murmuring her thanks again. She appreciated the woman's warmth, but it only served to highlight how out of place she felt. Once Mrs. Porter left, Lisa sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. The reality of her new life was beginning to sink in, and with it came a wave of uncertainty. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, though it was only the two of them. William sat at the head of the long dining table, dressed in a tailored suit despite the informality of the occasion. Lisa took a seat a few chairs away, the distance between them symbolic of the gap in their worlds. "You're settling in, I trust?" William asked as the butler served the first course. "Yes, thank you," Lisa replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. William nodded, his expression neutral. "Good. If you find anything lacking, let Mr. Collins or Mrs. Porter know. They are here to ensure your comfort." The meal continued in near silence, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain. Lisa found herself stealing glances at William, trying to decipher the man behind the composed exterior. He ate slowly, methodically, his posture impeccable. There was a weariness to him, though, an unspoken heaviness that lingered in the air around him. When dinner was over, William rose from his seat and looked at her. "You're free to explore the house and grounds as you wish," he said. "Just respect the staff's spaces and avoid my study unless invited. Good night, Miss Lisa." Lisa watched as he walked away, his steps steady but deliberate, as though each movement required effort. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of life he had led to end up here, alone in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. The following days settled into a routine. Lisa would wake early, eat breakfast in the sunlit kitchen with Mrs. Porter fussing over her, and spend her mornings exploring the mansion. Each room held a piece of history: antique furniture, faded photographs, and bookshelves filled with volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. She spent afternoons in the garden, where the gardener, an older man named Mr. Grayson, would greet her with a friendly nod but few words. William remained a distant presence, appearing only during meals or in passing. He was always polite, always formal, but never overly familiar. Lisa couldn't decide if his demeanor was meant to make her comfortable or to keep her at arm's length. One evening, as she wandered the halls, she stumbled upon a small music room. A grand piano sat in the center, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light of a chandelier. Curious, Lisa approached it, running her fingers lightly over the keys. The sound that emerged was soft, almost hesitant, but it filled the empty room like a whisper. "You play?" William's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. "A little," she admitted, stepping away from the piano. "Not well." He entered the room, his movements slow but purposeful, and gestured for her to sit. "Play something." Lisa hesitated, but his gaze was expectant. She sat down and began to play a simple melody, her fingers fumbling slightly on the keys. When she finished, she glanced up at him, unsure of what to expect. William nodded. "You have talent. With practice, you could be very good." Lisa blinked, surprised by the compliment. It was the first time he had spoken to her with anything resembling warmth. From that moment, something shifted between them. William remained reserved, but there were small cracks in his armor, moments when he let his guard down just enough for Lisa to catch a glimpse of the man beneath. And while the mansion still felt foreign, Lisa began to find small pockets of comfort within its walls. But even as she settled into this new life, a nagging feeling lingered at the back of her mind. William's illness, though never mentioned, was impossible to ignore. His quiet moments of fatigue, the way he sometimes winced when he thought no one was looking, it was as if he were carrying a secret too heavy to share. And Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that this life, like everything else, was only temporary. Lisa woke up early the next morning to the soft patter of rain against the window. The gray light filtering through the curtains bathed the room in a muted glow, a perfect match for her mood. Though she had begun to adapt to life in the mansion, the sense of displacement lingered. Everything felt borrowed. Her room, the luxury, the quiet rhythm of her days. It wasn't her world. It was William's. After a quiet breakfast with Mrs. Porter, Lisa wandered into the library. The vast room, with its towering shelves and plush armchairs, had quickly become her favorite spot. She liked the way the sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting patterns on the floor, and how the air smelled faintly of old books and wood polish. Today, though, the rain created a different ambiance, making the space feel cozy yet somber. She selected a book at random and settled into one of the armchairs. The house was unusually quiet, even for this place, and she let herself sink into the stillness, grateful for the reprieve from her own swirling thoughts. "Enjoying the library, I see." Lisa nearly jumped out of her chair. She looked up to see William standing in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a charcoal gray sweater and slacks, a departure from his usual formal attire. His expression was calm but curious, as though he were studying her reaction. "It's my favorite room," she admitted, closing the book in her lap. "There's so much history here." William stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were conserving energy with each step. He gestured to the seat opposite hers. "May I?" Lisa nodded, and he lowered himself into the chair with a soft sigh. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to tap against the windows, filling the silence between them. "This house does have history," William said finally, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the bookshelves, "though most of it is not as glamorous as it may seem." Lisa tilted her head, intrigued by the sudden openness in his tone. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "When people look at a place like this, they see wealth, success, stability. What they don't see are the sacrifices, the mistakes, and the regrets that built it." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "I've lived here alone for the better part of a decade. It's a big house for one person." Lisa hesitated, unsure if she should ask the question on the tip of her tongue, but her curiosity won out. "Why alone? Didn't you have a family?" William's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "I did, once. My parents immigrated to this country with nothing but hope and a willingness to work hard. They built a life here, brick by brick. I inherited their drive, but not their wisdom. I chased success at the expense of everything else. My marriage fell apart, and I never had children. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Lisa felt a pang of sympathy. She had spent so much time thinking of him as a distant, unknowable figure that she hadn't considered the weight he carried. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He met her gaze, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "Don't be. I made my choices. I live with them." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrests of his chair. "But enough about me. Tell me about you, Lisa. What brought you here, besides circumstance?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in such a direct way before. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I guess I've always felt responsible for my family," she began, her voice tentative. "My mom's been sick for a long time, and my siblings depend on me. Going to medical school was supposed to be my way of making things better for all of us, but it's hard to focus on your dreams when reality keeps pulling you back." William nodded, his expression unreadable. "And now you found yourself here, in a place you never imagined." Lisa managed a small smile. "Something like that." There was another stretch of silence, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt as though they were both processing the weight of their respective lives, the choices and compromises that had brought them to this point. "Lisa," William said finally, his tone more serious now, "I need to tell you something. I've been meaning to for some time." Her heart skipped a beat. There was something in his voice that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What is it?" He exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not a healthy man. I'm sure you've noticed." She nodded slowly, her throat dry. It was impossible not to notice the subtle signs, the way he tired easily, the occasional wince of pain when he thought no one was looking. "I have a terminal illness," he said, his voice steady but tinged with resignation. "The doctors have given me months, maybe less. I've come to terms with it, but I felt it was only fair to tell you." Lisa's chest tightened as she absorbed his words. She had suspected he was ill, but hearing it confirmed was different. I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. William shook his head. "Don't be. We all have an expiration date, Lisa. Mine just happens to be closer than most. What matters to me now is how I spend the time I have left." He looked at her, his gaze piercing yet kind. "That's why I wanted someone like you here. Not because I needed a caretaker or a companion, but because I wanted to leave something behind that mattered. Helping you and your family, it feels like the first truly meaningful thing I've done in years." Lisa didn't know how to respond. The man she had once thought of as cold and distant was revealing himself to be so much more complex, so much more human than she had imagined. She felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest, a mix of gratitude, sorrow, and something she couldn't quite name. The rain continued to fall as they sat there, the sound a gentle backdrop to the quiet understanding that had formed between them. For the first time, Lisa felt a connection to this house, to this man who had seemed like a stranger not long ago. And, for the first time, she began to see the potential for something deeper, an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to find meaning in a situation she had never expected. The days following William's revelation about his illness were marked by a subtle but profound shift in the mansion's atmosphere. The weight of his words lingered in Lisa's mind, reshaping her understanding of him and the life he had lived. He was no longer just a wealthy stranger with a cold exterior. He was a man grappling with his mortality, a man who had made mistakes and was now seeking redemption in his own quiet way. Lisa found herself drawn to his presence more often, though their interactions remained measured and polite. There was something grounding about his calm demeanor, something reassuring about the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the shadow of his illness. It was as though he had accepted his fate and was determined to face it on his own terms. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Lisa made her way to the garden. She had begun spending more time there, finding solace in the neatly trimmed hedges and the gentle trickle of the fountain. To her surprise, she found William sitting on one of the stone benches, a book resting on his lap. He looked up as she approached, his expression softening into a faint smile. "Good morning, Lisa," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, sitting down on the bench beside him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day." William nodded, his gaze drifting to the blooming roses nearby. "I suppose it's a lot to process." "It is," Lisa said, folding her hands in her lap. "But it's also made me think about my own life, about how much I've been running on autopilot, just trying to get through each day." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes sharp yet kind. "What would you do if you didn't have to worry about all of that? If the weight you carry were lifted?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead in years. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been so focused on taking care of everyone else that I haven't really thought about what I want." William was silent for a moment, as if considering her words. Then he spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You remind me of myself at your age, ambitious, driven, willing to make sacrifices for the people I cared about. But I made the mistake of letting those sacrifices define me. I lost sight of what really mattered." Lisa looked at him, surprised by his candor. "Do you regret it?" "Every day," he said simply. "But regret is a waste of time. It doesn't change the past and it doesn't build the future. What matters is what you do with the time you have left." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended. That afternoon, Lisa found herself wandering through the mansion's halls, her mind racing with thoughts of her own future. For so long, her life had revolved around survival, working, studying, scraping by, but now, for the first time, she was starting to imagine what it might look like to truly live. Later that evening, as Lisa was returning to her room, she noticed a light on in the music room. The soft strains of a piano melody drifted into the hallway, drawing her closer. Peeking inside, she saw William sitting at the piano, his fingers moving gracefully over the keys. His face was serene, a stark contrast to the weight he usually carried. She hesitated before stepping into the room, unsure if she was intruding. "I didn't know you played," she said softly. William glanced up, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I don't often have an audience." Lisa moved closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. "You're really good." "It's something I learned as a boy," he said, his hands still moving over the keys. "My mother insisted. She said music had a way of speaking to the soul." Lisa sat down on a nearby chair, captivated by the way the music seemed to fill the room. It was a simple melody, yet it carried an emotional depth that tugged at something deep within her. "Would you like to try?" William asked, breaking the spell. She shook her head, laughing softly. "I'm nowhere near your level." "Nonsense," he said, standing and gesturing for her to take his place. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about expression." Reluctantly, Lisa moved to the piano and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant. William stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. She began to play a simple tune, the same one she had practiced years ago on the old, out-of-tune piano at her childhood church. Her movements were awkward at first, but as the notes filled the room, she began to relax. "See?" William said, his voice warm. "You have a natural touch." Lisa looked up at him, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Maybe, but I still have a lot to learn." He chuckled softly. "We all do." In the days that followed, the piano became a bridge between them. Lisa would practice in the evenings, and William would sometimes join her, offering gentle guidance or simply listening. Their shared moments at the piano brought a new sense of connection, a quiet understanding that didn't require words. But as their bond grew, so did Lisa's awareness of the fragility of their time together. William's illness was always there, a silent presence in the background. She noticed the way he tired more easily, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was looking. And yet, he never complained, never allowed his condition to overshadow the moments they shared. One evening, as they sat together in the music room, William turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Lisa, there's something I want to do, something I'd like you to be a part of." "What is it?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated as if weighing his words carefully. "I'd like to write a letter, a sort of testament. Not just for the estate, but for the people I've known, the life I've lived. I want it to mean something." Lisa nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "I'd be honored to help." Over the next few days, they worked together in his study, crafting the letter that would become William's final gift to the world. He spoke openly about his regrets, his hopes, and the lessons he had learned. For Lisa, the experience was both humbling and transformative. She began to see her own life through a different lens, inspired by William's courage and introspection. As they finished the letter, Lisa felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity to know William, but for the ways he was quietly helping her rediscover herself. Their time together was limited, but it was proven to be more meaningful than she could have ever imagined. The mornings had grown quieter. The house, already subdued, seemed to carry the weight of unspoken truths. William's presence, once steady and composed, now carried a fragility that Lisa couldn't ignore. His illness was progressing rapidly. Though he never openly acknowledged it, the subtle signs were there. Longer pauses in conversation, deeper lines of fatigue etched into his face, and the way his hands occasionally trembled when he reached for a glass or a book. It was during one such morning that William invited Lisa to join him in the garden. He sat on the same stone bench where they'd spoken before, his pale complexion striking against the greenery that surrounded him. Lisa brought a cup of tea for him and settled on the bench nearby, sensing that he had something on his mind. "You've been kind to me, Lisa," William began, his voice soft but steady. "Kinder than I deserve, perhaps, and because of that, I want to share something with you. Something I hope will stay with you long after I'm gone." Lisa's chest tightened at the words. Though he rarely spoke of his impending death, the reality of it was ever present. She nodded silently, giving him the space to continue. "I've spent a great deal of my life chasing things that ultimately meant very little," he said, gazing at the garden fountain as the water sparkled in the sunlight. "Money, power, recognition. They were distractions, illusions of success. It took me far too long to realize that what truly matters can't be bought." He turned to her, his blue eyes clear and earnest. "You're young, Lisa. You still have time to choose differently, to build a life that isn't defined by what the world demands of you, but by what your soul craves. Don't waste it." Lisa absorbed his words, feeling their weight settle over her. "How do you know what your soul craves?" she asked quietly. William smiled faintly, as if the question carried both simplicity and complexity. "You listen, you trust yourself, and you let go of the fear that tells you you're not enough." Over the next 7 days, William became more open than Lisa had ever seen him. Each day brought a new conversation, a new insight. He spoke of his childhood growing up as the son of immigrants who had worked tirelessly to give him a better life. He shared stories of his youth, of mistakes made in the pursuit of wealth and status, and of the relationships he had neglected along the way. One evening, as they sat in the music room, he recounted his first love, a woman named Eleanor, who had been a pianist like Lisa. "She had this way of making everything feel alive," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia, "but I let her slip away because I was too busy chasing things that didn't matter." Lisa noticed the way his hands lingered over the piano keys, his touch lighter than before. "Do you still think about her?" she asked. "Every day," he admitted. "Not with regret anymore, but with gratitude. She taught me something I was too young to understand at the time, that love is the only thing worth holding on to. Not the kind of love that demands or controls, but the kind that simply is." His words stayed with Lisa long after the conversation ended. She found herself reflecting on her own life, on the choices she had made and the ones she had yet to make. For so long, her existence had revolved around duty and survival. But now, she was beginning to see a different path, a path defined not by obligation, but by purpose. On the 6th day, William invited her to his study. A large wooden chest sat on the desk, its surface worn with age. "I want you to have this," he said, gesturing to the chest. "Inside, you'll find letters, photographs, pieces of my life that I've held on to over the years. They don't mean much to anyone else, but to me, they're a record of everything I've lived and learned. Maybe they'll mean something to you, too." Lisa hesitated, her hands hovering over the chest. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you've listened," William said simply, "and because I see in you the kind of courage I wish I'd had at your age." She opened the chest carefully, her fingers brushing against the edges of faded photographs and handwritten letters. Each item felt like a window into William's past, a life filled with both triumphs and regrets, moments of joy and pain. As she sifted through the contents, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection to this man who had once been a stranger. On the 7th day, William asked Lisa to join him in the library. The rain had returned, casting the room in a soft gray light. He sat in his usual chair, a blanket draped over his legs, and gestured for her to take the seat across from him. "I have one last thing to ask of you, Lisa," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Anything," she said, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their time together was nearing its end. "When I'm gone, don't let this place become a burden. Let it be a stepping stone, a foundation for whatever you choose to build. Use it to help others, to create something meaningful. Promise me that." Lisa's throat tightened as she nodded. "I promise." William smiled, a faint but genuine expression of peace. "Good, then I can rest easy." That evening, after dinner, Lisa helped him to his room. He moved slower than usual, his steps unsteady, but he insisted on walking himself. As she tucked the blanket around him and turned to leave, he called her name one last time. "Lisa," he said, his voice soft but steady, "you've given me more than you realize. Thank you." Tears stung her eyes as she smiled at him. Good night, William." The next morning, Lisa found him peacefully lying in his bed, his expression serene, as though he had simply drifted away in his sleep. On the bedside table was a letter addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. The letter began with his characteristic clarity and grace, recounting his gratitude for their time together and the lessons he hoped she would carry forward. He ended with a simple yet profound message: "Live boldly, Lisa, love fiercely, and never forget that your worth lies not in what you do for others, but in who you are. Use what I've given you to create the life you deserve. I have no doubts you'll make it extraordinary." As the rain fell softly outside, Lisa sat by the window with the letter in her hands, her tears falling freely. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity, a quiet but powerful resolve to honor William's final wish and forge a life of meaning and purpose. The mansion felt emptier than ever. The quiet, which had once been comforting in its predictability, now seemed overwhelming, a constant reminder of William's absence. Lisa sat in the study where they had spent so many hours talking, his final letter resting on the desk in front of her. She had read it several times since his passing, each word sinking deeper into her heart. The letter was both a farewell and a roadmap, filled with reflections on the life William had lived and the life he hoped Lisa would build. He had left her everything: the mansion, his financial assets, and his personal journals. But it wasn't just the material wealth that struck her. It was the trust he had placed in her, the belief that she could use these resources to create something meaningful. Lisa folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Her emotions were a tangled web of grief, gratitude, and determination. She had spent so much of her life focused on surviving that the idea of thriving felt almost foreign. But William's words had ignited something in her, a spark of possibility she couldn't ignore. That afternoon, Lisa sat down with Mr. Collins and Mrs. Porter, the two remaining staff members of the household. They had both been with William for decades and were deeply affected by his passing. Lisa wanted to honor their loyalty and ensure they felt secure in this time of transition. "Mr. Collins, Mrs. Porter," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I know this house has been your home as much as it's been his. I want you to know that you're welcome to stay here as long as you'd like. But if you feel it's time to move on, I'll make sure you're taken care of." The butler and housekeeper exchanged a glance before nodding, their gratitude evident in their expressions. "Thank you, Miss Lisa," Mr. Collins said. "Mr. Harris always spoke highly of you. He trusted you to do what's right, and I can see why." Lisa smiled faintly, feeling the weight of their expectations. It was daunting, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, Lisa began to settle William's affairs. With the help of his lawyer, she reviewed his estate plan, ensuring that his wishes were carried out to the letter. True to his promise, William had left her everything she needed to provide for her family and pursue her dreams. The magnitude of his generosity was overwhelming, but Lisa knew she couldn't let it paralyze her. She had to move forward, for both of them. One of William's final requests had been for Lisa to use the mansion in a meaningful way. It didn't take her long to decide what to do. Inspired by their conversations and his commitment to helping others, she decided to transform the estate into a community center. It would be a place where underprivileged families could access resources, education, and support. A way to give back to people like her own family who had struggled for so long. The idea filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She began sketching out plans, meeting with architects and local organizers to bring her vision to life. The house, once a symbol of isolation and regret, was slowly transforming into something vibrant and hopeful. Rooms that had been untouched for years were being repurposed into classrooms, counseling spaces, and activity centers. The once quiet halls were now filled with the sounds of construction and laughter, a testament to the change Lisa was determined to create. Despite her busy schedule, Lisa made time for her family. She visited her mother often, bringing her updates on the center's progress. Her siblings, too, began to see the possibilities opening up before them. Jamal, who had always struggled to find his footing, expressed interest in volunteering at the center. Nia, still young but full of curiosity, wanted to take art classes in one of the new studios Lisa was setting up. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was personal. Lisa found herself reflecting on William's lessons daily, using his words as a guide for her own growth. She began journaling, a habit she had picked up from him, writing down her fears, hopes, and dreams. The process was cathartic, helping her navigate the complex emotions that came with such a significant life shift. One evening, as Lisa sat in the study reviewing blueprints for the center, she noticed the chest William had given her. She hadn't opened it since his passing, unable to face the flood of memories it would bring. But now, something compelled her to unlock it. Inside, she found the same collection of letters, photographs, and keepsakes she had seen before. But as she sifted through them, one item caught her attention, a small, leather-bound notebook tucked away in the corner. She opened it carefully, revealing page after page of handwritten notes in William's neat script. The notebook was a mixture of musings, advice, and reflections, written as though he had been speaking directly to her. One passage in particular stood out. Legacy is not about what you leave behind. It's about how you make people feel while you're here. If I've done anything right in my life, I hope it's helping Lisa see her own worth. She's stronger than she knows, and I have no doubt she'll create something extraordinary. Tears blurred her vision as she read the words. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection to William, as though he were still guiding her from beyond. The notebook became her companion in the weeks that followed, a source of strength and wisdom as she continued to build the center. By the time the grand opening arrived, the mansion was unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet, somber house was now alive with energy and purpose. Families filled the halls, children's laughter echoing through the rooms, and local volunteers bustled about, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Lisa stood at the entrance, watching as people streamed in. She felt a sense of pride she hadn't known was possible. This wasn't just William's legacy, it was hers too. That night, as she sat alone in the music room, Lisa ran her fingers over the piano keys, playing a soft melody she had learned during her time with William. The music filled the room, a reminder of the man who had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the notes, "for everything." And for the first time in a long time, Lisa felt truly at peace. The first light of dawn seeped through the tall windows of the mansion-turned community center, casting a soft golden glow on the freshly painted walls. Lisa sat at her desk in what used to be William's study, now repurposed as her office. The familiar weight of his leather-bound notebook rested in her lap, its pages worn from the countless times she had flipped through them. The mansion, once a silent monument to isolation, was now a vibrant hub of activity. It had been a year since William's passing, and in that time, Lisa's life had undergone a transformation she could never have imagined. The community center had grown beyond her wildest dreams, offering classes, counseling, and resources to hundreds of families in need. The halls were no longer quiet but filled with laughter, conversations, and the occasional sound of music drifting from the repurposed music room. Lisa's family had become a cornerstone of the center's success. Her mother, now healthier thanks to access to better medical care, volunteered in the kitchen, helping prepare meals for visitors. Jamal had found a sense of purpose working with the center's youth programs, mentoring kids who reminded him of himself. Nia, bright-eyed and curious as ever, had taken to drawing murals on the walls of the children's playroom, her creativity flourishing in the supportive environment. Lisa herself had grown in ways she hadn't anticipated. Running the center was no small task, but with every challenge came a new lesson, a new opportunity to push beyond her limits. She often thought of William during those moments, of his calm wisdom and the way he had encouraged her to trust herself. His voice echoed in her mind, a steady guide through the chaos. Today was a special day. The center was hosting its first annual Legacy Gala, an event designed to raise funds and celebrate the lives that had been changed through their work. Guests were beginning to arrive, and Lisa could hear the faint hum of chatter and laughter from the grand hall downstairs. She had spent weeks planning the event, ensuring that it honored not only the community, but also William's memory. Lisa closed the notebook and placed it gently on her desk. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress, a simple yet elegant navy gown that reminded her of the one she had worn at her wedding to William. The memory brought a bittersweet smile to her face. That day had been the beginning of a journey she hadn't fully understood at the time, a journey that had brought her here. As she descended the grand staircase, the sight that greeted her was overwhelming. The once formal dining hall was now alive with color and movement. String lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the crowd. Tables were adorned with floral centerpieces, and a band played soft jazz in the corner. Families, donors, and volunteers mingled, their faces alight with joy and gratitude. At the center of it all was a large photograph of William, displayed on an easel near the entrance. The image captured him in a rare, candid moment, a faint smile softening his usually stoic features. Beneath the photo was a plaque that read, "In love and memory of William Harris, a legacy of wisdom, generosity, and second chances." Lisa made her way to the stage, her heart pounding as she prepared to address the crowd. As she stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent, all eyes on her. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "Thank you for being here tonight. This event is more than just a celebration. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together as a community. And it's also a tribute to the man who made all of this possible." She glanced at the photograph of William, drawing strength from his image. William Harris was many things: a businessman, a philanthropist, and, above all, a teacher. In the short time I knew him, he taught me lessons that have shaped the person I am today. He showed me that life isn't about what we accumulate, but about the impact we have on others. He believed in second chances and in the power of kindness to change lives. And because of him, we are all here tonight. The audience erupted into applause, their faces glowing with appreciation. Lisa took a moment to compose herself before continuing. "This center is not just a place. It's a promise that no matter where you come from or what challenges you face, you have a place to belong, to grow, and to thrive. And I know that if William were here tonight, he'd be proud of what we've built together." As the applause rose again, Lisa stepped back from the microphone, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, conversations, and smiles. Guests shared stories of how the center had touched their lives, and Lisa felt a profound sense of fulfillment knowing that William's legacy had become a living, breathing reality. Later that night, long after the last guest had left and the lights had dimmed, Lisa found herself in the music room. She sat at the piano, her fingers brushing against the keys. The room was quiet now, the echoes of the evening celebration lingering in the air. She began to play a soft melody, the same one William had taught her in their fleeting moments together. As the notes filled the room, she closed her eyes, letting the music carry her back to those conversations, those lessons, and the quiet strength of the man who had changed her life. When the final note faded, Lisa opened her eyes and looked around the room. It was no longer the somber, lonely place it had once been. It was filled with memories, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. Standing, she glanced out the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. A new day was coming, and with it, new challenges, new opportunities, and new lives to touch. Lisa smiled, her heart full as she whispered the words that had become her mantra: "Live boldly, love fiercely, and never forget your worth." She turned off the light and walked out of the room, ready to embrace whatever came next. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales and exciting content. Share this video with your friends and family, and check out our other videos for more incredible stories. See you next time.